All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Are we set? Oh, wow. What a big crowd we have here, probably about 60 people and another 50 or 60 online. So welcome to everyone to our second Seesaw seminar of the semester. My name is Derek Haley, and I'm the director of the Gamble Center for the Study of Animal Welfare now. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's my pleasure today to introduce my cherished colleague, Dr. Niel, who will be our speaker today. Lee has been at OVC now for 15 years. We've been working together that long. She's in the Department of Population Medicine, and she holds the Colonel Cale Campbell Chair in Companion Animal Welfare. And she is also currently has a Hallett Professorship in Human-Animal Bond, which she's using to study rabbits and also to study cats, which is the species that we're going to be hearing about today. And in addition to all of her research success, Lee is known as an excellent teacher. So in 2021, Lee received the Teacher of the Year Award from the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association. And in addition to that, she's mentored successfully many graduate students. I think by last count, maybe 6 or 7 have gone on into academia. And for those, many of you may think, well, that's not the be all and end all. But for a graduate student, for a PhD student to survive graduate studies and think, I want to do that, I want to do what my advisor does, is tremendous. And so Lee's got a great amount of balance between her teaching and her research. And today she's agreed to talk to us about some of the work that has been done in her lab on cats. And the title of her talk is Complicated Cats or Clueless Caregivers. Lee is going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for questions and answers, and then we'll have some social time afterward for those that have the time to stay around today. So Lee, we look forward to your talk, and please help me in welcoming Lee.
Okay, so this is where I start to have mild panic attacks. I was talking to my husband last night about this, and every time I give a talk on cats, I get crazy questions from the audience that totally throw me off sideways. And so last night I was like, oh my goodness, like what type of question are people going to ask me today? And so I think that they are complicated cats. I don't fully understand them, and I sometimes feel like a clueless caregiver. So that's sort of our starting point for today. And if my slides advance, then we would be good. Okay. Okay, so let's start with a thought experiment though, because, you know, I study companion animals broadly. So let's take a step backwards to last month's Seesaw seminar by Dr. Shane Bateman, where he was talking about veterinary forensics and neglect and abuse. So imagine we have this dog, and so considering reporting this dog to the PAWS Act to try to get some assistance for the dog. So known to be free roaming, so owners don't really control him. He roams around the community. Nobody's really keeping track of what he's up to. He hasn't been to the vet for 5 years. It's pretty standard. They don't really think he needs preventive care. They're not that worried about vaccinations. Extended time alone. They tend to go away. Sometimes they go away for a weekend. They leave out some food and water for him. They figure that that's probably acceptable. They find him really complicated. He's really difficult to read his like signals and those types of things. So he's often aggressive. So they want him to like engage and cuddle with them. And he's really just not that interested. So they find him really complicated. They have a really limited budget for his care. So, you know, and not just money, but also time. You know, he's a lot of work, you know, having to walk him every day. So they don't really want to consider that as an option. Playing with him takes a lot of time too. And what they really want is a pretty like self-sufficient pet. And they love to tease him. And then when he acts really funny, post the videos on YouTube. And so how many of you feel like potentially reporting this owner for this dog? There's some nodding out there. What about if I change it to a cat? How many of you would report this cat? So what we find is that in general, there's very different attitudes towards the care and management of cats in comparison to how we care and manage dogs. So it's pretty standard for a large percentage of cats to be free roaming. There's lots of studies that show that cats have limited vet care. They often spend extended time alone. People often refer to them, and there's some studies out there that just suggest that people find their cats complicated. They're not really a money sink. So if your dog needs to go to the vet and has a serious health concern and it's going to cost $2,000, often that's not really a stretch for people. But if it's their cat that has that concern, then suddenly that budget seems astronomical and crazy when they could just go and get another cat from Kijiji. And we have endless YouTube videos of people teasing cats. I would say in some cases torturing cats, doing everything that they can to scare them, and then recording the response and posting it. And they have millions of views and likes, and everybody thinks that it's really, really great. So cats versus dogs, what do we know? They receive less vet care. They're more often to be relinquished to shelters. Not only that, but they're more often ending up in shelters as strays. And when they do result in shelters where dogs, for the most part, get reclaimed by their owners, the majority of cats don't. Nobody ever comes to claim them. They just end up staying in the shelter. More likely to free roam outdoors. Does anybody know a dog in Guelph who free roams outdoors who's within the city limits? No, not a. Does anyone know a cat that free roams within the city limits? Yeah, lots. They are perceived to be low maintenance, so they're an easy pet. I hear people talking about leaving them home alone while they go on vacation for the weekend. Leave out enough food and water and just like walk away, and that's okay. The cat will be fine. I don't need to play with my cat, walk my cat, do any of the things that I would do with my dog because cats are easy and low maintenance. And historically, there's been very little research on cats. So very little money available to fund cats, and very little research specifically in behavior and welfare in terms of trying to understand cats and their needs. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to give a brief intro about cats in general, cats in Canada, and then I'm going to talk about two recent research projects that have happened in the last 5 or so years that sort of explore some of these key issues that we run into when we're trying to better understand cats and the ways that people treat them. So I'm going to talk about some cat communication research that was done by Christina O'Hanley. And then I'm going to talk about some outdoor access research that was done by Anastasia Stellato in combination with 2 undergrad and veterinary students. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what's next. So cats are the most popular pet in Canada, actually the most popular pet in the Western world. So they are the only animal that is tracked by StatsCan. So dogs are not tracked by StatsCan, but cats are. And so the basic stats that we know are that there are about 8.9 million cats in Canada in households. That doesn't include populations that are outdoors, in comparison to 8.3 million dogs. So they're winning on the number front. 21% of households in Canada have a cat, and 12% have 1 cat, 7% have 2 cats, and then 2% have 3 or more. So if you're in the 3 or more, you're a rare part of the population. Cats and humans. So dogs have a long history of domestication, as do cats. So recent evidence suggests that domestication started about 10,000 years ago. And there's very clear, obvious evidence from 3,000 years ago. So cats and humans have a long-term relationship working together. Cats performed hunting services for humans is the sort of prevailing theory in terms of how they ended up integrated into our communities. So people bring food, which brings rodents, which brings cats. And so those cats were hunting and they seemed useful to people is the theory. And so they were provided with additional food and care and those types of things. The cats that weren't that scared stuck around more. Slowly over time, we ended up with domestic cats. One thing that's really important to recognize is that in comparison to dogs, where it was like a cooperative relationships, where we trained dogs to do things for us, cats were doing things quite independently. And often in the literature, you'll see them described as self-domesticated. So when we look at the numbers, we see only 10% of cats are purebred, so very, very small percentage in comparison to a majority of dogs. And we don't tend to breed cats. They tend to breed themselves. They end up getting rehomed through Kijiji or going through shelters, those types of things. And so we aren't controlling their breeding. We're not sort of selecting for different things in that breeding, what they look like, what they do, those types of things. So cats are cats. And when we have feral cats, they can generally survive quite well in the wild. I wouldn't say that they thrive in Ontario, but they can definitely survive and find everything that they need and function like any wild animal would. So just in terms of like setting the scene for some of the things we're going to talk about, it's also important to know some key characteristics about cats. So cats are solitary, but that doesn't mean that they like to only be alone. They very much do bond with humans. And what we know about cats is that they're social when resources allow. So if there is enough available for everyone to share and enough time, like space for separation and those types of things, they form social groups. And they form quite cohesive social groups and large social groups. However, because they are solitary, a lot of their communication occurs at a distance. So they leave markings so that they can avoid each other. They have like larger signals, like puffing up and those types of things that you can see from far away. They're less good at the sort of subtle close-up types of signals. Cats are also carnivores that hunt. So they're a prey animal, and often across the Felidae, people talk about them being solitary hunters. So they're not hunting with their group, they're hunting on their own. And so it means that it's not like there's certain individuals within that group that are the only people, the only cats that hunt. So each cat has some level of prey drive. This can also be expressed through play, though. They also have exploration and activity needs because they would normally be out roaming around looking for prey animals. And then finally, another sort of hallmark of cats is that they spend a lot of time sleeping and resting. So a large percentage of their day would be spent in sleep time. And so they need some level of safety through hiding and perching, and those are really common behaviors for them. So when we're thinking about some of the things that they need to be able to have some social contact, but their needs are going to vary and they need to moderate that contact. They need to be able to hunt and play, and they need to be able to have safe places where they can rest. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two different research projects that have been ongoing in the lab in the last 5 or so years. The first that I'm going to talk about is cat communication. So cat communication is really critical to moderating appropriate relationships between people and their animals. So we know that close contact supports bonding and positive human and cat welfare. So when we look at the literature, we see that when there's positive relationship between the cat and the human has mental health benefits, and it seems to be also an improvement for cat welfare. However, often these interactions don't go perfectly. And so what we see is a number of different welfare concerns with cats being fearful or avoidant or potentially aggressive. Obviously, welfare concerns for the cat also can lead to serious safety concerns if those cats do become aggressive. And then the key thing is that this can lead to breakdown of the human-animal bond, potentially the owner no longer wanting that cat in the household, can lead to either relinquishment, sort of passing off the problem to somebody else, or euthanasia. So it's really critical that we properly read cats to avoid these types of negative interactions. And there is some previous research on this. So Georgia Mason and myself and Lauren Dawson and Jenna, oh my goodness. Niel did a project looking at people's ability to read positive and negative emotions from cat faces. And people could get above chance, but they were relatively mediocre at it. There's some research showing that owners and non-owners are decent at predicting cat behavior from video scenes. So if you show them a video, they're decent at being able to predict what's likely to happen next at a rate of about 80%. And then a more recent study, owners are decent at interpreting positive and negative emotions from images. So in this case, not just the faces, but more broad. They're better at really overt behavioral cues than they are at subtle ones, and it does improve with training. So there's some indication that people have, a reasonable understanding of cat behavior, but that they do struggle with it. So where we were really interested in looking at this further is the idea of avoiding negative states. So as much as possible, we want people to be able to understand when their cat is experiencing fear and aggression, and be able to recognize those signals so that they can avoid those negative interactions with their cat in the future. So our objectives for this project were to determine which behaviors and postures owners can accurately identify. So if a person's looking at their cat, what can they actually see? Can they see that the ears have changed position, those types of things? And we also wanted to determine whether they could appropriately categorize cats in terms of whether they were likely to perform fear and aggression, or whether they were experiencing fear and likely to perform aggression. And we wanted to assess the effect of training to look and see whether, if we gave them key information, whether they could improve in their ability to work with cats. So this project was led by Dr. Christina O'Hanley. She recently defended her PhD thesis, and she's working at Texas Tech as a professor of practice. So just giving her credit for all of this work that she did. So in her first study, the one where she was looking at what types of behaviors people could actually recognize, we had 2,653 cat owners, and they watched 3 videos each. And then for each of those videos, they scored whether particular behaviors and postures were present or absent. So they had a list of 26 behaviors, and for each one, they had to say, yes, no, I saw this particular behavior or posture in the video. So just giving an example here. So the sound doesn't come through, but obviously you're seeing hissing. When people were watching the video, they would have seen the hissing. And just to be clear, we did not record these videos ourselves. They were sourced off of YouTube. We found a feral cat website that had lots of different examples of different cat responses that we were able to use for these videos. So the types of things that they were scoring were the posture of the cat, their ear and tail positions, what types of vocalizations they were performing, as well as looking at whether their pupils were dilated, if they were showing fear behaviors like lip licking and freezing, and whether they were showing piloerection. So what was the good? So for each of these, we calculated the sensitivity and specificity. So for sensitivity, we were looking at whether they got the ones that were actually present correct, whether they actually saw that they were there. And for specificity, we were looking at whether they could recognize that certain behaviors were not present when they were missing from the video. And so you need to be able to do both to be able to say whether the cat's performing those behaviors or not in a reliable way. So some of the ones that cats could observe were abdomen position, so where the abdomen was in relation to the ground, whether the ears were pushed back, whether the cat had a tucked tail, and dilated pupils, so when you get sort of large pupils when cats are stressed. They could also recognize rapid tail movements, swatting, and avoiding. And then finally, they could see key vocalizations, so meowing, hissing, and growling. So this is pretty good. They're seeing some of these really obvious overt behaviors that would tell them that a cat is potentially really scared or not happy. But they were struggling with some other behaviors. So some of the ones that they struggled with were the opposite of the dilated pupils. So being able to recognize the neutral and constricted pupils. the back position, so whether the back was arched or not, the head position and whether it was lowered or raised, whether the ears were sideways, so back is sort of all the way back, but they were struggling with the sideways position, the tail being upright. So a key behavior that indicates whether a cat is friendly is often this tail upright behavior. They also struggled with some more subtle behaviors, so freezing, lip licking, shaking of the head, piloerection, so the hair standing on end, and slow moves, which we often see in fearful animals. And then finally, they struggled with the yowling. And so they could get the growling and the hissing and those types of behavior, but yowling often has sort of like a modulated component to it where the frequency goes up and down, and they struggled with that one. And so just to be clear, we gave them definitions for all of these in advance. So they did have something to go off of when they were looking to recognize them. In the second study, what we did with this information was that we took the different pieces in terms of understanding how people were looking at cats, and we used it to develop a training system. And we tested whether they could categorize cats appropriately and whether training was effective. So again, we had over 2,000 cat owners, and they were watching, in this case, a number of videos, and they did it twice. So they watched 8 videos, and then they were divided into groups, and they either had a training component or no training. And then they came back at the end and watched 8 more videos. So it's not in the diagram because it makes it too complicated, but we had 2 sets of videos, and they received them in random order. So it wasn't that they all got sort of like, it was a different set of videos. So there were members of the group that got all of the different videos in the first set, and there were members of the group that got all of the different videos in the second set. They were just swapped for some people. What we asked people to do in this particular case, rather than looking at those specific behaviors, was to look holistically at the cat and try to categorize them. And so the key categories that we wanted them to look for were no fear or aggression. The cat is fearful with no immediate potential for aggression. So it's a scared cat, but doesn't represent a threat. The cat might become aggressive. So there's some indicators that the cat is more in that zone where it's likely to respond aggressively, or the cat is aggressive. So in this case, we're looking for actual attempts at swatting or biting. So for the people that were in the training program, we developed this using the information from study 1, and we were also really clear for the ones where they were struggling to identify them in giving information. So for each of the 4 categories, we gave them an exemplar, and we went through it in detail, the types of behaviors that they would be looking for. So for this cat on the top is fearful with no immediate potential for aggression. So it was recommended that they should be looking at things like the lowered abdomen, the lowered tail, partially dilated pupils, etc. And then on the bottom, you can see that they were given specific information on different body parts as well that went into more detail that allowed people, that allowed people to, I guess it's an emergency alert. Okay.
No, this is an ambulance.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so yeah, so we teased apart the sort of different areas and gave them more detailed information about what they were looking for. So on the bottom, what you can see is the ear position of the cat. So on the top, you can see neutral ears pointing forwards. In the middle, you can see ears pointing to the side. And then on the bottom, you can see ears pointed backwards. So really giving them that key information that they need to be able to see those differences between them. Beyond that, we gave them sort of the overall interpretation. They're still up, so maybe we'll just ignore it and hope that it's okay. Okay. All right, we're okay for now. Okay. It's giving me warnings. All right. Oh, okay. It's gonna go now. Okay. So in terms of analysis, it was a mixed logistic regression model with participant as a random effect. And our outcome was whether they correctly categorized the video. We assessed the effects of severity categories, so those 4 categories, as well as the impact of training. We also looked at video order assignment, as well as the particular set that the video that we were coding was, or that we were analyzing was within. So I just sort of put those at the bottom because I'm not focusing on them as much. So here are our scores by category. Just remembering category A is the no fear or aggression. Category D is the full on aggression. And what we have in green is the individuals who had training. In gray, we have individuals with no training. And so this is the proportion correct. So what we can see is for category A, no fear or aggression, they were doing really well. However, if we look at category B and C, where they were looking for those more subtle indicators that would tell them that a cat was fearful or that a cat was fearful and potentially aggressive, they were struggling more. Category D was a bit intermediate. They were better at D. And what you can also see is that for all of the groups, there was an effective training. Obviously, category A didn't have very far to go. We saw more of an effect in the other categories. And where we saw the biggest effect was in category D with the individuals who were identifying whether a cat was actually aggressive or not. So the training was actually effective for improving their ability to recognize these signals. We kind of have some room to go still with those middle categories, and that's where we really want people focused in because we want them heading things off before they get to the aggressive stage. So just some conclusions from this study is that most cat owners can detect obvious behaviors, but many of them were missing the more subtle cues. Untrained owners are good at recognizing cats with no fear or aggression, but they struggle with the increased severity. And then training improves severity recognition for all categories with the largest effect for actual aggression. So this study was really helpful for getting a picture of where people are in terms of trying to communicate with their cats and understand what they're showing. So just one example of the ways that we're trying to tackle this complicated cat question. All right. The second study that I want to talk about is some research that we've been doing on outdoor cats and the issue of cats roaming outdoors. So this is a complicated issue, and while many people in North America have quite clear opinions about it, it is not something that people universally agree about, especially within the welfare community. So my colleagues in the UK would say cats should absolutely be able to roam, that it's cruel to keep them indoors, versus most of the recommendations that are coming out of Canada and the US are that cats should be kept indoors for their safety. So in terms of the rationale for allowing outdoor access, it's that sort of cats have these natural desires to explore, to hunt, to perch, to scratch, all of these different behaviors, and that containing them inside doesn't allow them to perform these behaviors. And I'll just sort of slide in there that I'm guessing our dogs would also prefer to have the freedom to roam the neighborhood, but we don't allow them to do this. We really focus on looking at other ways. Like I know Tina is out walking her dogs every day and making sure they get lots of exercise and lots of play. So we put a lot of effort into keeping our dogs entertained, versus with cats, the options seem to be either allow them outdoors or do nothing. So what are some of the concerns with outdoor access? So one of the major causes of cat trauma is vehicle accidents. Predation is a huge concern. In Guelph, for example, we have coyotes, and we know that in regions where coyotes are, cats are more likely to go missing. But they might not go missing for the coyotes. They might also get lost and end up at the shelter. And as we talked about before, when they end up at the shelter, they're not that likely to be claimed by their owners. When they're outdoors, they have increased potential for disease transmission or for parasites and things like that. So those are on sort of the cat welfare side of things. But there are also human concerns about cats roaming. So one of them is about cats being a nuisance. So making noise, digging in people's gardens, those types of things. But a much larger one, and actually this is the one place where there's lots of funding and lots of research for cats, is about trying to prevent predation by cats of small prey animals. So major concerns about the potential impact of cats on prey species. And I'll just point out a large proportion of that predation is happening in feral cat colonies, not in owned cats, but owned cats do have an impact. So that's sort of the concern in a nutshell. So when we're talking about outdoor access, it's important to think about what type of outdoor access cats might have. So we have indoor only, and we have uncontrolled outdoor access, which it means like they can do whatever they want. But in between that, there are a number of different controlled types of outdoor access. So for example, taking a cat out on the leash, allowing a cat to play in a catio, potentially having them in a largely contained area and keeping track of them. So our different categories, we have indoor only, we have controlled, we have uncontrolled, and we have uncontrolled but some restriction. So the details really matter in terms of the potential behavior and consequences for the animal. So some stats on outdoor access, it really varies regionally. Like I said, there's huge differences across different countries. So in the US and Canada, we tend to be the most restrictive. So we have the largest percentage of cats that are kept indoors. Australia and New Zealand are intermediate, and the UK and Europe tend to have the largest number of free roaming cats. So a reasonable estimate from Canada, put out by Humane Canada in 2017, suggested that 28% allow uncontrolled outdoor access, so full free roaming, not monitoring what the cat's doing. 16% allow controlled outdoor access, and 56% have indoor only cats. And a vast majority of humane organizations are requiring people to sign off that they will keep cats indoors. So in terms of trying to figure out whether it's a welfare issue to contain cats indoors, really the question we need to answer is, what do cats do outside, and is letting them go outside the only option for meeting these needs? So we know that there's huge variability in home range and activity in terms of different cats, and it varies by the sex of the cat, the type of what type of weather and the season, and also the type of region that they're in. So home ranges for owned cats are about 1 to 2 hectares, but they can have dramatic variability within that, with some cats really just sticking in their own yard and some cats having a home range of 113 hectares in one study. So that cat is traveling a lot. The majority of the time, though, even for those ones that are traveling a lot, they're spending their time within 50 to 100 meters of home. So they're relatively close to their house. And studies have shown that there's no effective feeding or enrichment on home range size, but there is some impact on the type of prey that are brought home. So other people have looked at the activity of owned cats that have outdoor access and what do they do while they're out. So 80% of the time they spend sleeping, 17% in low activity, and only 3% in high activity. So if we sort of suss this out, what we're seeing is the vast majority of cats are sticking close to home, they're spending a lot of their time sleeping, and they're spending like a small proportion of their time doing stuff. So personal opinion is that we should be able to meet that 3% need within a home environment and sort of try to minimize some of those welfare and predation concerns, and also maximize the welfare of cats. So it's really trying to think about what is that high activity spent doing and how can we replicate that in the home. So the cat on the bottom is a cat from Marley Pyatt's study over from Integrated Biology. She was working with Elizabeth Gow and Ryan Norris. So putting cameras on cats and then sending them out with that, and it tracks what they're up to and the types of risks that they encounter. So I think this is one of sort of the first steps towards really understanding more of those specific details of what cats are doing when they're outside, which is, we don't fully understand that yet. Okay. What about indoor cats? So for indoor cats, we have limited research on social and environmental features. We really don't know that much about them. Most of the research that's been done on enrichment in cats has been done in shelter environments. There was one study that was based through a veterinary clinic where they asked people to describe what they provide for their cats. And they found that people do provide a variety of enrichment. So 78% have toys at all times, and 90% of owners said that they played with their cat at least once per day. And I wonder if that's true. I don't think that we always answer truthfully on these surveys, but I do wonder if that's true. And then we really have very little data on preferences and efficacy of different types of enrichment, especially when thinking about how it might impact different cats. We just don't have any data on it so far. There is some data looking at comparing indoor versus outdoor cats and trying to get some sort of a feeling for whether there's a welfare concern. But the one study had quite limited and variable data. Cats that were presenting for a behavior consult, they found that there was a higher percentage of cats that were presenting for behavior consult that were indoor only in comparison to a control group that were mixed indoor and outdoor. Another study compared indoor only versus outdoor through a survey-based study and found that there was a higher frequency of some behavior and health issues. So for example, house soiling was a higher frequency for indoor cats. Another study looked at increased time outside and found that it was associated with an increased number of behavior problems. So they reported more examples of behavior problems for that cat. And so that was actually for the cat that was going outside, not for the one that was inside. And then indoor only cats, some studies have been done looking at their motivation for predatory play, and they did find that it was increased in comparison to cats who could go outside. So for this study, what we did was a survey on outdoor access. So it was a cross-sectional online survey, and we did it only for Canada and the US, given all of the variability in terms of the perspectives across different countries. And we really wanted to understand what was going on here. It was a convenience sample, so we put it out there and snowballed it. And we ended up with, in less than 2 weeks, I think it was just over a week, Sarah had almost 8,000 responses, and we had to like shut it down because it was going too crazy. But I do think that we ended up with keeners on both ends as like the people who were pouring into that survey. And so I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. So our objectives for this survey, there was two. We wanted to understand how and why people provide outdoor access, and also to assess the effects of outdoor access on behavior outcomes. And we were attempting to account for enrichment by asking them about what types of enrichment they provide in the home. So this study was done by Sarah Tan and Sarah Jaju. They were undergraduate students working in the lab who were really interested in this topic, and Dr. Anastasia Stellato, who's also at Texas Tech, was helping out with this project. So in terms of what our sample looked like, we had 57% indoor only, 22% had controlled outdoor access, and 21% had uncontrolled outdoor access. So this suggests that we had fewer people that were allowing their cat outdoors in an uncontrolled way in comparison to sort of the general population. When you look at the bottom graph, what you see is the types of controlled outdoor access that people were providing. So for example, putting them out on a leash, harness, or tie out, using an enclosed area that like a catio, or allowing them to roam but directly supervising them. So the first thing we did was looked at what associations there were with providing outdoor access to better understand, who were the people that were allowing their cats out and why. So some cat characteristics showed an increased odds of uncontrolled outdoor access. So male cats were more likely to be allowed out than females. Older cats were more likely to be allowed out than younger cats, and particularly cats under 1 year of age, people were more likely to keep them indoors. And then cats that were healthy were more likely to be allowed out than those with medical issues. The bigger driver, though, were the owners and owner characteristics. And so some of the things, and this is where I say we had sort of like a split group, is we had a lot of responses from rural individuals who were quite strongly supportive of outdoor access, particularly for vermin control. And when we looked at sort of what types of demographics with owners influenced the results, so rural versus urban location, women versus men, and higher education versus high school. So people who reported lower concerns about the risks of being outdoors were more likely to allow the cat out, as well as people who had higher agreement with the benefits. So we asked a series of questions, so that makes sense. In terms of potential welfare concerns, there were some risks that we identified for cats that were allowed outside. So of the cats that were allowed outside, 7% were declawed, 43% didn't have a collar, 56% weren't microchipped, 69% were not licensed, and 3% were not neutered. So not only were they going outside, but if they did become lost, it wasn't very likely that they would be reunited with their home. So in terms of sort of the conclusions for the sections, decisions were largely associated with owner perspectives and location. But it's possible that the current picture is historical. So if you have a 15-year-old cat and they started making that decision 15 years ago, they might make a different decision with the cat that they have currently. However, when we're looking at those welfare risks, they're very much current, right? Like a cat going out without a collar, so that's a concern. And we really need to understand how these perspectives develop and how flexible they are. And then the key thing that's sort of missing is really needing to understand the welfare risks indoors. So in terms of I'm just going to go through these really quickly. We also looked at the other side of things. So looking at the behavior outcomes for cats that were kept indoors in comparison to those that were allowed outdoors. So some key things that we saw were that aggression with other household cats was increased in the animals that were allowed outside in comparison to indoor, but there was an interaction with number of cats. Opposite to that, towards household people, higher levels of aggression in indoor cats in comparison to the uncontrolled ones. Nighttime activity was a sex interaction. It was complicated. It's not really clear that there's an effect there. Excessive vocalizations, very much more so in our in our indoor cats in comparison to ones that had controlled access, but not really anything to do with the uncontrolled cats, so the ones who were free roaming. Scratching, there was no associations, and house soiling with an interaction through medical condition. So what we kind of end up with at the end is that there's no clear pattern in terms of there being an issue for the indoor versus the outdoor cat specifically. We also looked at the effect of enrichment, playtime, and training, and the effects were really mixed depending on the behavior that we were looking at. There was no interactions with outdoor access, so it suggests that enrichment really isn't interacting with that outdoor access to make a difference. And what we need is a lot more nuanced information to understand this better. So in terms of the conclusions for this part, it's really unclear. We really need more research, and what we need is longitudinal and intervention studies to better understand that causation. So some final thoughts. So cats are complicated, and in many cases, I think that owners haven't been given the info that they need to understand that cat, and we're really behind on the research for cats in terms of understanding them. So we need more research to inform appropriate care. More research, like we've looked at negative communication signals, but positive. So what things do cats like, and really understanding those positive communication signals, the impacts of indoor restriction, and really like what key things should we be providing in terms of indoor enrichment and management. And sort of like one of the larger things that I'm really interested behind the scenes is how do we raise the general status of cats in society so that we don't have these huge gaps when we look at how they're treated in comparison to other species. So thanks very much for listening. Sorry, that was a little bit long, but